Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Deborah Thien, Dean of the College of Liberal Arts at California State University, Long Beach. I'm meeting with Dr. Hugh Wilford, a professor in the history department and preeminent historian of the Central Intelligence Agency, to talk about his new book, The CIA, An Imperial History. Dr. Wilford came to CSULB in 2006, and he has been a prolific scholar throughout his more than 3-decade academic career. 6 books, dozens of journal articles, essays and presentations, and numerous awards. Dr. Wilford, Hugh, it is a pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you, Deb. It's a pleasure to be here too.
Before we talk about your book, I want to ask you, why the CIA? Why and how did you become a leading expert in one of the most clandestine and influential organizations in the world?
Well, there was a large element of chance involved. My earliest research was on something apparently quite different, which was a group of intellectuals in New York in the middle years of the 20th century, all quite left-wing, all very concerned with literature and literary criticism. And then I came across this strange story that some of their journals had received CIA funding, secret CIA funding in the 1950s. And naturally, I was curious, so I followed up on that and discovered that there was this whole story of the so-called Cultural Cold War, which was the struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union for the hearts and minds of the world's intellectuals. And I began investigating that and found it utterly fascinating. And gradually, I moved over into the study of the CIA. I was still fond of my New York intellectuals, but I realized in the CIA there was a perhaps sort of rather bigger and historically more consequential story. I also have to confess that I found when talking to publishers and even people at parties, when I said I was working on the CIA, I generally got a more positive response, more interest than when I previously I'd said I was working on literary intellectuals. So that was a factor as well, I have to confess.
Well, the thread is actually there because in this book you also talk a lot about the fiction and the poetry that influenced the CIA and its evolution and the people, of course.
Yes.
So when was the CIA founded and why?
Well, it was founded quite late compared with other Western intelligence agencies, not until 1947. And I guess that's because, the United States has historically been so suspicious of secret government power. But in 1947, the government felt, I think, that after World War II and the US emerging as really the great global hegemon that it still is, that it needed a peacetime intelligence agency. So it was under Harry Truman. He sort of basically resurrected the wartime US intelligence agency, the Office of Strategic Services. So as a result, the CIA, originally it was really primarily an intelligence gathering body, just analyzing intelligence and then passing on what it had learned to the president. Within a few years of its existence, it had acquired a covert action mission as well. So not just observing and sort of analyzing the world, but intervening in it as well. In that respect, it was sort of echoing what the OSS had done during the war. But that there's always been a sort of tension, I think, in the CIA between those two missions, between intelligence on the one hand and covert action on the other, just as there's always been a tension between the fact that it is this secret service in the middle of a nation that doesn't like secrecy. Yeah. And so the sort of, I think that's been another central defining tension in its history between democracy and openness on the one hand and the fact that it is a secret and covert action dedicated unit on the other.
You talk in the book about it being about hyper secrecy versus at the same time the very public image of the CIA. So that's an interesting dynamic. This book, The CIA, An Imperial History, is your 4th monograph about the CIA. Why this particular book now?
Well, my previous books had all been about particular CIA operations or regions that those operations had impacted. But then about 5 years ago, I was asked to do a series of video lectures for an adult learning platform called The Great Courses. And that required me to sort of write a chronological narrative overview of the whole CIA's history from 1947 down to the present day. And as I did so, ideas began occurring to me, bigger arguments of a sort which weren't really sort of appropriate for that format. So another book began sort of like cooking away, as it were. And I think what I particularly wanted to do was bring the CIA more into the field of the history of American foreign relations, or America in the world, as it tends to be known now. It's intelligence history is this, in academic terms, it's this sort of slightly strange marginal pursuit. So, but the larger field of America in the world has just been a really intellectually exciting sort of innovative place. Recently, it's taken a series of so-called turns, including an imperial turn. So, sort of getting away from thinking about the US as sort of exceptional in terms of world history and its hegemonic power as not imperial, which I think is how many Americans have tended to think of it. Diplomatic historians are increasingly trying to sort of compare and contrast and connect the history of US foreign relations with that of earlier world empires. And I wanted to sort of put the history of the CIA in conversation with that body of scholarship as well.
Well, following up on that, can you talk more about your argument that the CIA's intelligence gathering mission became a smokescreen to mask American imperialistic ambitions around the globe?
Certainly, yes. I think that part of that sort of reorientation of the history of American foreign relations is to sort of recast the Cold War as a sort of quite an old-fashioned imperial rivalry. I mean, obviously with additional elements like the clash between capitalism and democracy and communism. But in many ways, it was a sort of rerun of what an earlier generation had called the Great Game, which was the conflict between Imperial Britain and Imperial Russia in Central Asia. So I wanted to sort of relate the history of the CIA to that earlier history. But of course, there is a big difference, which is that when the US and the CIA entered the field in the early years of the Cold War, this is also the period of decolonization, of the collapse of old empires, so that you can't really... You can't afford to look and act like an empire overtly in the world. So a lot of the sort of the work of empire, so getting rid of foreign governments which aren't seen as serving the empire's interests and strengthening others that are, that work was charged to this covert government agency. And I think this is why the CIA, which is why I think its covert action mission just grows exponentially in its early years as it acquires this basically imperial, sort of covert imperial function. I should just add to that the CIA officers themselves and very much and individuals are very much to the fore in the book. I sort of hang a series of discussions of sort of different types of CIA operation from particular founding generation officers who were sort of most identified with them. These people weren't sort of conscious imperialists. If anything, actually, they were anti-imperialist, right? They were sort of heirs to
sure. Some of the
yes, exactly. They America, after all, the United States was sort of the first anti-colonial nation, right? It had been founded in an act of rebellion against an empire, and also another element of this was that there was a surprising element in the early CIA of missionary influence. Americans who had been overseas trying to convert foreigners to Christianity and lived overseas. Not many Americans had lived overseas, so this is why when this foreign intelligence agency began recruiting, it turned to either former missionaries or the descendants of missionaries, and a lot of those a lot of those people had actually become quite anti-colonial. They'd become very sympathetic with the struggle of people colonized by European empires against those empires. And so there's this sort of element of missionary anti-colonialism in the early CIA as well. So there's a sort of, in addition to those other tensions I mentioned earlier, I think there's a sort of conflict going on here between this imperial mission with which the agency is charged and the inherent anti-colonialism of a lot of the people who are charged with it. And so that the history of the CIA is to a large extent the sort of how the imperial mission eventually wins out over the anti-imperial tendencies of the officers charged with carrying it out.
There's a dynamic that comes across in the book between home and away. Can you talk more about how the CIA is famous and also infamous here in the United States, and that leads to something you describe and other scholars describe as imperial boomerang? What is an imperial boomerang, and how does it manifest domestically?
Sure, yeah. The much of the book, the second half largely actually is taken up with looking at the CIA sort of domestic footprint, as it were. And again, I'm trying to relate it to other scholarship about empires, and a number of European and post-colonial intellectuals had observed how empires don't just stay overseas; they have a way of coming home as well, returning home exactly. And I think what we're looking at with the CIA and sort of how famous, infamous it becomes domestically is a form of imperial boomerang, because it improperly it's supposed to purely be a foreign agency operating overseas. It does actually engage in some domestic operations. During the 60s and 70s, it surveils the anti-Vietnam War movement, for example, Black nationalists, the Black Panthers. It runs an operation called, it's almost, you couldn't make this up, called MH Chaos, to surveil these really sort of anti-imperial elements within. So to some extent, it's this sort of imperial government formation, sort of against anti-imperialists within the U.S. population, because anti-imperialism is strong. It's a very strong tradition in American political life. So another sort of manifestation of the boomerang effect, the imperial boomerang, was the fact the CIA also, it's a propaganda agency in addition to its various other functions, and most of that propaganda is aimed overseas at winning overseas populations to the American cause in the Cold War against communism, and then later in the War on Terror against terrorism. But it also carries out some propaganda at home as well, in a sort of effort through friendly journalists and front groups that it's covertly funding, like those intellectuals I was talking about earlier. So these boomerang effects just play out, I think, for decades, and they help explain as well another sort of aspect of the CIA's domestic history, when really it shouldn't have a domestic history, and that's the fact that it's featured so much in American popular culture and conspiracy theory. I think conspiracy theory in the US is as old as the US. It's always been around, right? But it received this big shot in the arm during the post-World War II period, and I think it's largely because there is this growth of the secret state and agencies like the CIA, which are surveilling US citizens, propagandizing them. So it's hardly surprising, perhaps. I mean, obviously, a lot of conspiracy theories surrounding the CIA are just kind of like nuts, right? They staged the moon landings and things like that, or that it faked 9/11 as well to justify the war on terror. That's been a big recent one. But it's perhaps understandable that in a nation with a tradition of conspiracy theory, that the appearance of this secret government agency in its midst doing things it shouldn't be doing domestically has given rise to these kind of paranoid fears about it.
Yeah, and the pop culture effects too, we could talk at length about as well. But let me move on to talking about the global war on terror, since you just brought that up. The epilogue in the book focuses on the global war on terror, How does the CIA's imperialistic DNA influence the modern war on terror?
Well, again, I think there are so many echoes of earlier empires and imperial small wars, as they used to be called, in the war on terror. It largely overseas. It largely takes place in sort of old imperial battlegrounds, like the Russians and the British were fighting the Great Game in Afghanistan, for example, and then the war on terror sort of returns there. And I think a lot of US tactics in the war on terror echo imperial small war tactics of earlier powers, and explicitly so, sort of counterinsurgency doctrine used by US forces in Iraq during the occupation there actually draws on text by people like T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, the old British secret agent. So, and CIA operations in particular, I think, sort of reflect this old imperial history. Even though they look very sort of modern and high tech, drone warfare, for example, that targeted killings, that particular another mission given to the CIA. And I'm not original in this respect. There was a Stanford historian called Priya Satia who first noticed this. There are echoes in what drones are doing over AFPAC, the Afghanistan-Pakistan region, and earlier British bombing campaigns in the early 20th century over Iraq. Waterboarding, enhanced interrogation techniques, as though EITs, but basically torture, but going on in CIA black sites where terrorist detainees or suspected terrorists were being detained. There's a sort of imperial prehistory to that as well. There was something called the water cure that US forces used during the colonial occupation of the Philippines at the beginning of the 20th century. So I'm afraid that there were all of these echoes all over the war on terror, including and also another imperial boomerang effect, right? The years of the war on terror see another massive expansion of the US surveillance state. So again, I think you probably get it by now, right? So all of these echoes. I just wrote about it in the epilogue. Sort of, I felt I could have filled another book with them.
I'll come back to that. But what is the biggest misconception you came across about the CIA?
Probably that it's the phrase "rogue elephant" has really attached itself to the CIA. It was when it was being largely because of operations like MH Chaos during the 1970s. There was a series of congressional investigations into it in the mid 70s, and Frank Church, who was chairing the best known of those investigations, called the CIA a rogue elephant. And I don't really, implying that it's just it's out of control. It's charging around. It's gone rogue from the U.S. government, and I don't really. Yes, there is a lot of adventurism around it especially the early CIA. I write quite a lot about how CIA officers were influenced by British imperial spy fiction, and in particular Rudyard Kipling's Kim. And the nickname Kim is all over the early history of intelligence in the Cold War. So that there is an element here of young men sort of wanting to go out and have these great, secret adventures in the world. So I'm not denying, and I guess later on that would be James Bond, Jack Ryan, and I think, fiction is a big influence, I think, on these people. So, but nonetheless, that I guess that's what's kind of driving individual officers. But as a sort of institution, I think the CIA is not a rogue elephant. It's actually, very much a US government agency that is doing the bidding of successive presidents, because even presidents who dislike the CIA, and there have been several of them, Richard Nixon in particular, couldn't bear them. He thought they were a bunch of sort of Ivy League snobs. But he was very happy to reach for it when he wanted to get rid of, most famously, the government of Allende in Chile. So, I think that's probably the biggest misconception. That the CIA is somehow outside of government, operating independently. I think if it's been very much part and parcel of U.S. foreign policy, and even has done things with misgivings that it's been charged with doing. You know, sometimes if you look at the documents, you can find internal expressions of dissent from what presidents are ordering the agency to do, but it nonetheless goes ahead and does it anyway.
So coming back to the comment you made a few moments ago about there's more to say, and you also make a statement at the very end of this book. You say the imperial history of the CIA is not over. So what do you think is next for the CIA, and what do you think is next for you as a scholar of the CIA?
As regards to what's next for the CIA, that's a good question, because of course we're recording this just after Donald Trump has won the presidential election, and Trump is famously not a friend of the U.S. intelligence community. You know, because of the investigation into Russian influence on the 2016 election, he sees it as part of the deep state that's out to get him. And there is a lot of disquiet within institutions like the CIA at the moment about what's going to happen to it under a second term of Trump. But there's even fear it will be it might be done away with. It might be abolished. But my own hunch is that won't happen. The CIA has survived sort of existential crises before, like the investigations of the 1970s, like the early years of the War on Terror. You know, because 9/11 was a big intelligence failure, and then there was the WMD debacle in Iraq. So. And yet the CIA survived those crises. I think it's too useful, I think, to presidents actually for them to want to do away with it, much though they might dislike it, like Nixon did and like Trump currently does. As for me, what I might do next, well, to tell you the honest truth, I would dearly like to be done with writing about the CIA. I've been, as you said in the introduction, I've been doing it for many years now. And I have other projects I'd like to go to, but it's sort of, I felt this before actually. I thought my previous book was the last book on the CIA, but I sometimes feel like I'm in a sort of a bad spy movie, with the narrative of how somebody thought they walked away, they retired, but they call back for another mission. I feel the CIA has a habit of doing that to me as well, just as a historian of it. So we'll see what's next. Okay.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dan.
I really enjoyed this conversation. I also really enjoyed this book. The CIA in Imperial History was released by Basic Books UK in 2024, and it's widely available online. More information about Dr. Wilford and links to purchase the book are in the description below.